I was on the operating table recovering from a severe life-threatening accident that had nearly taken my leg when they pulled the trigger. They didn't just betray me, they committed the ultimate act of financial savagery while I was doped up on heavy IV pain medication. My wife Emily and Mark Jennings, my supposed friend and her old college acquaintance, walked into my hospital room a few days later with flowers and a clipboard. I was still hazy, the world shifting and blurring at the edges. I thought they were just being supportive. They smiled, held my hand, and told me how strong I was. That clipboard held papers, I was told, were merely insurance forms and temporary signing authorizations required to keep the company, Ascend Tech, running smoothly while I healed. This wasn't some corner shop. This was my life's work, a $50 million software firm I had built from nothing over 15 brutal years. I signed it without reading, without question, completely trusting the woman who wore my ring and the man she called a friend. That trust cost me everything. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal that cuts deeper than any injury, stick around. You won't want to miss the chapters of sweet, calculated retribution that follow. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the twists in this true story. Emily and I had what looked like the perfect marriage: the house, the boat, the endless trips. The company, Ascend Tech, was our shared crown jewel, though I ran the day-to-day operations and held the decisive majority stake. The problem started about 6 months before my accident when Mark, the closer Jennings, re-entered our lives. Mark was always slick, too slick. He presented himself as a high-powered business consultant specializing in scaling and exit strategies. He was charming, he was always dressed in tailored suits, and he seemed to know all the right buzzwords. He spent his time whispering in Emily's ear at dinner parties. He didn't criticize my work directly. Instead, he'd drop casual, corrosive comments in Emily's presence. You know, Ascend is doing great, but maybe the founder's approach is a bit emotionally attached for the next phase of scaling. Or to Emily, in a concerned voice, he works so hard, darling. For tax efficiency and to lighten his load and simplify future wealth transfer, you really should have more direct, formal control over the operational assets. He subtly painted me as an outdated visionary, slow to adapt, and too sentimental about the bottom line. Emily, who had always trusted me implicitly, started asking loaded questions. Not supportive questions, but challenging ones about cash flow and corporate structure. The air in our $1 million home began to feel thin and cold. I started spending more time at the office, not realizing I was walking straight into the trap they were meticulously laying. I simply believed Mark was just a highly ambitious, slightly annoying consultant. I couldn't have been more wrong. He was the snake, and Emily was the perfect vessel for his poison. The insurance forms I signed in my hospital bed were, in fact, the final transfer documents, giving Emily the majority control he needed to execute his plan. Before the hospital, before the accident, Mark had already laid the professional groundwork for their heist. It was subtle, brilliant in its malice, and entirely believable to someone who was too busy building the actual product, me. He called it the Pinnacle Protection Plan. He brought a thick binder to my office. The cover was glossy, stamped with an impressive but meaningless gold seal. The meeting wasn't about software, it was about paper. Mark used phrases like asset segregation, liability firewalling, and capital flight minimization. To a busy founder focused on R&D, it sounded like the necessary, boring legal overhead. His core proposal was this: to protect our personal wealth from any future corporate lawsuits, a standard paranoia in the tech world. We needed to split my majority shares. Emily, as my legal spouse and co-owner of our joint assets, had to take on significant managing interests in a newly formed holding company. It's purely a structural maneuver, Mark assured me, leaning forward conspiratorially. It shows the IRS a clear chain of fiduciary oversight, preventing the piercing of the corporate veil. He had Emily in the room for this specific meeting. She played her part beautifully. She looked worried, asking just enough concerned questions about our future and protecting the kids. We didn't have any, but it was effective emotional leverage. She acted like she was reluctantly accepting this burden for the sake of our family's safety. I remember signing the main set of documents not in a lawyer's office, but late one Friday evening in our kitchen over a bottle of expensive wine. Emily even kissed me on the cheek afterward, telling me I was smart and that she was proud of how well I handled the business side. Now, looking back, that kiss feels like the cold, clammy touch of a professional executioner. It was a farewell kiss to my old life. What I didn't grasp was the legal fine print. Mark hadn't just separated assets, he had restructured the voting power and operational control. My personal shares, while still substantial on paper, were effectively neutralized by Emily's newly created super voting management shares. This move, cloaked in the guise of tax efficiency, ensured that if she ever voted against me, my power was gone. He designed the perfect legal chokehold. The moment I signed, Mark had the blueprint for the takeover. All they needed was the right trigger. And the universe, in its cruel irony, provided that trigger 3 weeks later in the form of a slick, rain soaked road and a nasty car crash that put me in the hands of the medical team, and ultimately into the hands of my betrayers. The scene in the hospital room, the clipboard, the painkillers, that was just the final gruesome flourish on a meticulously prepared document. They made sure I was not only weak physically, but legally neutered before they even handed me the divorce papers. The real cruelty wasn't the theft, it was the cold, calculated method. I got home from the hospital 2 weeks later, hobbling on crutches, exhausted but relieved. Emily was strangely distant, professionally helpful, but emotionally gone. I attributed it to the stress of the past month. I was wrong. The day I finally managed to take a shower without assistance, the real floodgates opened. The delivery guy handed me a thick manila envelope. Divorce papers? They weren't just standard separation documents. They were aggressive. Emily wasn't asking for half the assets. She was demanding everything, including my total exit from Ascentech. The legal terminology was dense, but the message was crystal clear. I was being replaced financially and domestically. The documents, drafted by a high powered shark firm Mark must have hired, cited my recent physical incapacitation and my emotional volatility as reasons why I was unfit to continue managing the company. They were using my near death experience against me. The cruelest part was the timing of the restraining order. Before I could even call my own lawyer, a court injunction froze all my personal and corporate accounts. They used the super voting management shares Mark had set up, the shares Emily now held, to legally block my access to all working capital. I was the founder, still technically the majority stakeholder in value, but I couldn't even pay the hospital bills without permission from the woman who was divorcing me. I confronted Emily in the master bedroom, trying to stay calm despite the seismic shock. I remember the air conditioning was too high, and the room felt like a freezer. Emily, what is this? We built this together. We are a team, I pleaded. She didn't raise her voice. That was the most chilling thing. Her voice was flat, practiced, like she was reading a script Mark had written for her. We were a team, David, but you've become complacent. Mark and I agree the company needs sharp, aggressive leadership to reach the next level. You're holding us back. You can keep the house for now, but Ascend is mine. It was always going to be mine eventually. That's when the truth hit me. A blow harder than the car crash. This wasn't a messy divorce. This was a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a marital split. Mark hadn't just seduced my wife. He had convinced her to commit grand larceny, promising her a CEO lifestyle without the hard work. He was the puppet master, and she was the willing, greedy tool. I looked at the woman who was supposed to be my partner and saw only a cold-blooded collaborator. In that moment, the love died, and something much harder, much colder took its place. An absolute, unwavering focus on retribution. The official expulsion was swift and humiliating. One morning, still unable to drive, I hired a car service to take me to the Ascend Tech headquarters. I needed to look them in the eye, to demand answers, to fight for the legacy I built. I didn't even make it past the lobby. Two large, emotionless security guards intercepted me. They held a laminated memo. "Mr. Peterson," one of them said flatly, avoiding eye contact. "Per the unanimous vote of the board of directors, your access to the premises and company networks has been revoked, effective immediately." The memo, I later found out, was signed by Emily. Mark, now styling himself as the interim CEO, was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in my old corner office. They escorted me to my assigned parking spot where they handed me a small cardboard box containing my few personal desk items. A framed photo of Emily and me from our honeymoon, a bitter joke now, and my favorite coffee mug. The guard also returned my company laptop, wiped clean, and my keycard, snapped in half. But it was what they didn't take that sparked the fire in my belly. In that box beneath the photo was my old backup key fob for the server room. I had forgotten about it as it was only used for emergency maintenance. Mark and Emily, in their arrogance, assumed wiping the laptop and snapping the main card was enough. They underestimated the sheer volume of access points I had created over the years. More importantly, they missed a critical detail related to my token shares. In the settlement, they had allowed me to keep a fraction of a percent of non-voting stock, a symbolic gesture of my founder status, they called it. This was their biggest mistake. While these shares carried no operational power, the legal agreement tied to them granted me, as a legacy shareholder, read-only access to a few specific, high-level financial reports: the quarterly balance sheet, certain vendor payment schedules, and crucially, the audit logs of the legacy accounting system. This old system was scheduled to be decommissioned, but was still running in parallel with the new software Mark had pushed. Mark, focused on the shiny new toys and the high-level boardroom, had completely forgotten about the dusty old back-end system I knew intimately. That night, alone in the silent, cold house, I bypassed the main corporate firewall using the old system's backdoor login. A complicated proprietary code phrase I knew they couldn't have wiped. I wasn't after data right away. I was observing. I watched, invisible in the digital shadows, as Mark's credentials logged in. He wasn't working. He was simply clicking around, making sure my name was scrubbed from every corner of the system. He seemed to be savoring his new title. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for money or revenge. I was fighting for justice against two people who had mistaken my injury for weakness and my trust for stupidity. They thought they had left me with nothing but ashes. They failed to notice the tiny spark of access that was about to burn down their entire stolen empire. For 2 weeks, I lived like a phantom in the digital heart of Ascentech. Using my relic access to the old system, I didn't hack. I simply audited. I meticulously tracked every major transaction, looking for patterns that betrayed Mark's amateur greed. It didn't take long. Mark was supposed to be optimizing, but he was merely indulging. I saw immediate, unexplained increases in executive lifestyle expenses, a 300% jump in the corporate travel budget, almost entirely focused on five-star resorts and first-class flights to destinations Emily frequented before the divorce. He even signed off on replacing all the functional high-end furniture in my old office with bizarre avant-garde pieces, all billed to the company at inflated prices. He was using Ascend Tech as his personal slush fund and decorating budget. But the real crack in their defense was in the contracts. In the first 60 days of his leadership, Mark had alienated 3 key software vendors by unilaterally demanding impossible payment terms. He tried to bully them, something I knew never works in the long-term tech supply chain. His worst offense, however, was his treatment of the engineering staff, the backbone of the company. I saw the internal memo. Mark had not only fired my longtime CTO, but had demoted an exceptional veteran engineer named Ben. Ben had been with me since day one, a brilliant mind in server architecture. Mark demoted him to an entry-level maintenance role purely out of spite because Ben dared to question Mark's technological decisions. I knew Ben was my only chance for an inside man. He was loyal to the mission, not the leadership. The meeting had to be outside, safe, and entirely deniable. I messaged him using an old encrypted chat channel we built years ago for emergency testing, another system Mark didn't know existed. I suggested a meeting at a generic diner miles away from the city. Ben was cautious, his face etched with months of frustration and resentment. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I laid out the truth. Mark didn't just steal my company, Ben. He stole your future. He's treating Ascend like a party fund. I have the data showing his fraudulent spending and his incompetent contract changes. But I need more. I need to get inside the new server architecture he installed. Ben looked at the evidence I showed him on my tablet, the bloated travel expenses, the ridiculous furniture invoices. His eyes went from cautious to cold, burning with betrayal. He told everyone I was incompetent, David. Said I couldn't handle the scale, Ben muttered, his voice shaking slightly. The new server architecture? I built it before he demoted me. I know every access point, every vulnerability. In that moment, I knew I had an ally. Ben wasn't motivated by money. He was motivated by the restoration of his professional integrity. We shook hands beneath the fluorescent lights of that cheap diner. The game had just changed. We were no longer reacting to Mark. We were planning the perfect surgical counterattack. Ben and I spent the next month working in the shadows. Our makeshift command center was the back room of a quiet, nearly defunct library I rented a small office in. It was dark, cheap, and totally off-grid, the perfect place to plot a corporate execution. The goal wasn't to crash the system. That would be too messy and too easy for Mark to trace back to me. The goal was to make his incompetence undeniable and his leadership structurally bankrupt. We needed a financial bomb that looked like a slow-burn administrative disaster, exclusively caused by the new management's negligence. Ben's insider access was surgical. He used his low-level maintenance credentials to gain temporary, intermittent access to the core contract database. Our focus was on the 3 major supplier contracts, the ones Mark had tried to renegotiate with impossible terms back in Part 5. Here's the trick. Mark hadn't actually finalized the new aggressive payment terms. He just sent angry emails and assumed the legal team would iron it out. Since Ben knew the architecture, he found the draft versions of these agreements still sitting on the active server. We didn't change the terms Mark was bullying them with. Instead, we altered one small critical parameter on each of the original contracts. For supplier A, which handled our core cloud hosting, we changed the payment trigger from net 60 days to net 5 days, but only for high-priority service spikes. This would look like an internal administrative error under the new management. For supplier B, the hardware provider, we quietly inserted a late payment penalty escalation clause, making the penalty triple after the 10th day, retroactively applied to any late payment in the last quarter. Mark was already late on 2. The masterpiece was with supplier C, the biggest and most critical. We added a seemingly innocent, archaic clause from an old template, a change of control mandate. This mandate stated that if the original founder, ME, was removed from executive control, the supplier had the unilateral right to raise their service fees by exactly 20% on a 3-month rolling schedule, effective upon any management change not approved by the founder's designated proxy. It was a clause I had put in years ago as a safeguard against a hostile merger, which Mark, in his rush, had completely ignored in his optimization audit. We executed the changes over 3 successive nights. Ben would log in for 5 minutes, make a small, untraceable change, and immediately log out. Everything we did was subtle, designed to pass the routine automated compliance checks Mark had installed. They weren't looking for sabotage, they were looking for security breaches. Our work looked like sloppy data entry and the activation of forgotten legacy clauses. They won't see it coming for weeks, Ben said, watching the final confirmation ping. It's all on their books, David. It just needs a trigger, a big order, a service spike. Once those bills hit, the internal accounting will implode. I felt a cold satisfaction. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about exposing their shallow betrayal. They had been standing on a financial landmine, and we had just finished planting the fuse. Now we just had to wait for Mark to be arrogant enough to step on it. The financial detonation wasn't a bang, it was a slow, agonizing hemorrhage. We waited exactly 4 weeks. It was Mark's arrogance that pulled the trigger. He secured a massive, lucrative contract with a demanding client, the kind that requires immediate, high priority service spikes. The moment that client's system scaled up, supplier A's net 5 days clause kicked in. The bill arrived 4 days later, demanding immediate payment for a service Mark expected to pay for in 2 months. The new accounting team flagged it, but Mark, buried in celebrating the new client, waved it off as administrative noise. Then came supplier B. They issued a formal notification detailing the triple penalty for the 2 overdue payments, citing the forgotten escalation clause. The amount due wasn't just late fees, it was a penalty that ate up the profit margin of the new client contract. Mark exploded. I saw his email chain. Ben forwarded the screenshots, where he threatened to sue the supplier, completely ignoring the fact that the clause was legally valid, even if dormant. The real chaos, however, began when supplier C's 20% price hike went into effect due to the change of control mandate. This wasn't a penalty, it was a permanent, massive increase in their operational costs. The company's quarterly forecast instantly looked catastrophic. Ben described the scene in the office. Mark was screaming at the CFO, blaming him for not catching the clauses. Emily, who had only been concerned with her new title and the corporate credit card, was now panicking about the bottom line. She started accusing Mark publicly of mismanagement. I watched, invisible as their alliance began to fracture under financial pressure. The most valuable mistake Mark made was his public response. Instead of calmly addressing the administrative errors, he held an emergency press conference. He tried to project confidence, but only looked sweaty and rattled. He blamed the failures on sabotage by disgruntled former employees and legacy system failures. This was golden. By blaming the legacy system, he inadvertently pointed the finger back at the contracts I signed, further distancing himself from the intentional malice of the clauses. I also received several tips from a third, non-affiliated employee, someone loyal to the old regime, about Mark's increasing desperation. He was liquidating non-core company assets, like my custom-built server rack, for quick cash to cover the immediate supplier crisis. He was effectively eating the seed corn to survive a single week. I had everything I needed: undeniable proof of incompetence, public admission of system failure, and the visible destruction of their unity. The time for observation was over. The time for the checkmate was near. The time for subtlety was over. I reached out to the one lawyer I trusted implicitly, a sharp, almost ruthless corporate litigator named Sarah. She was expensive, but if anyone could navigate Mark's legal quicksand, it was her. I presented Sarah with the dossier we had compiled: the hospital consent forms, evidence of their predatory timing, Ben's reports on Mark's excessive spending and liquidity crisis, evidence of breach of fiduciary duty, and Mark's public press conference claiming legacy failures, evidence of gross incompetence. Sarah studied the material, her expression unreadable. "It's damning, David," she finally said. but it doesn't give you the company back directly. The divorce settlement, even if predatory, is sealed. We need an angle that bypasses the divorce and attacks the corporate governance directly. I then reminded her of the one tiny asset I still held, the single percentage point of non-voting stock Mark had allowed me to keep, purely as a legal oversight to make the transition look smoother. Is there anything in those bylaws about the minority shareholder's right to petition the board? Sarah's eyes lit up. She spent 3 days deep diving into the ancient bylaws of Ascend Tech, the ones I wrote myself 15 years ago. She found it. Article 14, Clause B, remedial oversight. This clause stated that if a minority shareholder could prove systematic gross mismanagement that jeopardizes the company's solvency, they could demand an emergency board meeting to vote on the immediate restructuring of the executive team. This is our trigger, David, Sarah announced, slamming the book shut. The triple penalties, the rising costs, the liquidation of core assets, all of it screams jeopardizing solvency. We use your single share not to vote, but to demand a review. And we time it perfectly. Our evidence was now framed as a meticulously documented argument for the immediate removal of both Mark, for incompetence and financial misconduct, and Emily, for knowingly failing her fiduciary duty as a majority shareholder and board member. We had screenshots of Mark trying to sell intellectual property at a fraction of its value. We had the internal accounting projections showing a net loss of 40% in the last quarter, a direct result of our Trojan horse contracts kicking in. The true genius of the plan was how it flipped the narrative. We weren't arguing over my divorce, we were acting as the savior of the corporation. We sent a formal, sealed letter to the board members, the ones Mark and Emily had installed, but who were now terrified of being legally implicated in the collapse. The letter was clinical and precise. It didn't mention my name as the victim, only as the concerned minority, shareholder. It demanded an emergency board of directors meeting in 72 hours, threatening massive lawsuits against individual board members for negligence if they failed to comply. The clock was ticking. I could almost taste the fear on the other side. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. It was held in the company's main boardroom, a room I designed, with a huge mahogany table where I had closed deals worth millions. When Sarah and I walked in, Mark and Emily were already seated, flanked by their own nervous-looking lawyer. They had clearly spent the last 72 hours arguing and panicking. Mark wore a suit that was clearly too tight for him, a nervous sheen on his forehead. Emily, on the other hand, looked furious and betrayed. The rest of the board members, 3 passive investors Mark had brought in, looked terrified, shuffling their papers and avoiding eye contact. Mark immediately tried to seize control. "Mr. David," he sneered, using my first name with faux familiarity. "It's highly irregular for a minority shareholder to disrupt things. We're here to vote on a crucial asset sale to stabilize the company, not to listen to your baseless accusations." That was the key. They planned to sell core IP assets, the real value of Ascend Tech, for quick cash, covering their mistakes and leaving the shell for me to inherit later. Sarah cut in, her voice cold and commanding. "Mr. Mark, we are here under Article 14, Clause B, to address systematic gross mismanagement and the resulting jeopardy to the company's solvency. The proposed asset sale is evidence of that mismanagement." She projected the internal accounting report onto the screen. It showed the disastrous 40% loss, the triple penalties, and the permanent 20% increase in operational costs. Mark tried to interrupt, claiming the data was flawed. "Flawed?" I finally spoke, my voice calm, contrasting sharply with his hysteria. "You called it legacy system failure in your press conference 2 weeks ago. You blamed the architecture I built. Now you blame the accounting. Which is it, Mark? The truth is, you simply didn't have the competence to run this machine." The true drama unfolded when Sarah presented the evidence of financial misconduct. She displayed screenshots of Mark's expense reports, the high end furniture for his personal apartment, the first class tickets for Emily's business trips that coincided with luxury resorts. This, Sarah declared, pointing to a receipt for a $15,000 watch, was purchased using company funds 1 week after Mr. Mark stated the company was facing a liquidity crisis. This is a blatant breach of fiduciary duty. Emily stood up, pointing at Mark. I didn't know about the watch. This is his fault. He misled me. She was trying to distance herself, but she was too late. Sarah turned her attention to Emily. As the majority shareholder, Mrs. Emily, your fiduciary duty required active oversight. Instead, you authorized Mark's reckless decisions, benefiting personally from the company's downfall. Furthermore, we have evidence in the form of recorded voicemails showing Mark confirming to you that the liquidation of the core server rack was necessary to pay personal debts, not just company ones. The board members gasped. That sealed their fate. It wasn't just incompetence, it was a conspiracy to defraud the company. Mark, completely cornered, let out a desperate guttural sound and lunged across the table toward me, eyes blazing with pure hatred. Two security guards, who Sarah had wisely prearranged, were on him in an instant. This wasn't professional, it was primal. You set me up, you snake, he screamed as they pulled him back. I simply looked him in the eye. You tried to sign away my life when I was on morphine in a hospital bed, Mark. This is not a setup. This is a consequence. The three board members, desperate to avoid their own legal exposure, unanimously voted. The resolution was swift: immediate termination of Mark's employment and his CEO status, and the forced sale of all majority shares held by Emily back to the corporation at a heavily discounted price, based on the current, ruined market valuation they had created. Their control was nullified. In less than 30 minutes, the company was back in my hands, secured by the single tiny thread of my 1% share. Checkmate. The aftermath was swift, efficient, and deeply satisfying. Mark and Emily faced the consequences they earned. Because Sarah had framed the takeover as corporate malfeasance rather than just a divorce dispute, they were hit hard. Mark was legally barred from participating in the tech industry for 5 years, and the evidence of him using company funds for personal gain led to a serious financial investigation. Emily, though avoiding jail time, lost every single asset she had tried to gain. The heavily discounted sale price of her shares was swallowed by legal fees and penalties. They disappeared from my life as quickly as they had tried to destroy it. I never looked back. Rebuilding Ascendtech wasn't easy. They had left it bleeding, its reputation damaged and morale shattered. But this time, I wasn't doing it alone. Ben, the loyal engineer, became my new chief technical officer, and Sarah, the brilliant lawyer, became my corporate counsel. We cut the dead weight, stabilized the finances by reversing the disastrous contracts, and focused on our core values: innovation and integrity. The company not only recovered but flourished, driven by a new energy and the clear absence of toxic ambition. But the biggest change wasn't in the balance sheet. It was in me. That betrayal stripped me bare, but it also forced me to find true strength. I learned that my self-worth wasn't tied to my spouse or even my success, but to my ability to overcome. I finally closed that dark chapter and opened a new one. A year later, I met Clara. She was a venture capitalist, sharp, funny, and incredibly kind. Crucially, she wasn't interested in my money or my title. She was interested in my story, my resilience, and my vision for the future. Our relationship is built on mutual respect and genuine partnership, a world away from the golden cage Emily offered. I found true happiness and peace. I regained my company, sure, but I also reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future. Mark and Emily thought they were stealing a future. They were actually just cleaning the slate for me to build a better one. This story is intense, I know. It's hard to imagine being betrayed by the two people you trusted most. But I managed to turn pain into power and pure revenge into total reclamation. Now I have to ask you, my audience, did I do the right thing by engineering their complete financial downfall? Or should I have just walked away? What would you have done in my place? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming true stories, revenge tales, and mind-blowing life lessons. Thank you for listening.